You know, how many times have you heard the subject of Red versus Ash brought up before? Whether it's their strength as trainers or who is a better leading protagonist, this is one of the age-old topics in the fandom. And I'm not going to delay in bringing up the fact that this comparison was usually brought up from people who simply didn't like Ash. If you go and look around for discussions comparing the two, it was always immediately brought up under the lens of that Ash is some sort of mediocre trainer and that Red is this untouchable legend. But how much truth is there to this? Well, join me today as we try to analyze who the better protagonist is, Ash or Red. Before we get into the video, however, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Upside. Right now, money is tough for just about everyone, with inflation constantly rising across the globe and no real end currently in sight. So whether you're a driver buying gas, someone who does a lot of grocery shopping, or someone who just prefers going out for a meal, you could probably use a little help. Upside can offer that help, being an app that will help score you cash back on any of those purchases. Don't go thinking I'm just blowing smoke, because this is in fact really good and really true. When I use Upside, I end up using my cash back to flow right back into what I've spent, which lets my savings stay strong in these testing times. So to get started with Upside today, go locate the app in the Google Play Store or the App Store and use the promo code MYSTIC94 so you can get $5 back on your first purchase of $10 or more. You just need the check-in out of business, use your method of payment, and it's all good to go. Upside offers you 3 times more in rewards than with just regular loyalty programs you may get with your credit card. Whether you're cashing it out for money via PayPal or gift cards for Amazon, there's no shortage to how you can enjoy your Upside rewards. I suppose that's why Upside users are earning more than $1 million a week, and how the app has a 4.8 star rating in the App Store. Once again, it's code MYSTIC94 to get $5 back on your first purchase of $10 or more. Thanks again to Upside, and now on to the video. First, we should talk about Trainer Red. He is the first playable trainer and main protagonist in the history of the entire franchise, and it definitely feels like Game Freak went out of their way to make sure that would feel like an important part of his legacy as the series went on. But we'll get to that a little later. Talking about Red beyond just the legacy of the character is actually rather tricky, as a lot of things about him are left to interpretation. He doesn't speak, and back when the series was brand new in the 90s, no one was thinking about Red as a character at all. He was just an avatar-type character for the player to experience the Pokemon world through his shoes. He was as good or bad as the player themselves were. Perhaps the one notable characteristic we knew from playing the game was the fact that Red canonically treated his Pokemon well, unlike his rival Blue, who had a much more defined characterization. This is generally implied in NPC dialogue throughout the game, and is really hammered in by Professor Oak after the champion battle. So, as everyone knows, Red defeats his rival to become the Pokemon Indigo League champion. This still prestigious feat isn't unique at all for player characters in this series, but with Red, it feels far more pronounced. Not only is it the first time players got to experience it, but of all playable characters, Red is the only one that the series really gives a presence to after his respective games. This is largely because of Gen 2, where Red made an appearance as the final post-league battle in Mount Silver. When the games were new, most people had no idea about this, so it was such a shock to see that this battle existed at all. I'm actually convinced that the reason this battle is held in such high regard is in very large part because of the initial shock that everyone had when they realized that the trainer standing at the peak of the mountain was the trainer you played in the first game. It was like players were battling against themselves, seeing some of the Pokemon they themselves used, facing old friends from an earlier point of your childhood. If you were a kid at the time that got to play through both games during the earlier parts of the Pokemon craze, then you probably have memories of kids talking about this fight at school. It really was a big deal back then. All of this, despite the fact that Red wasn't the protagonist of the Gen 2 games, is absolutely a part of the character's legacy. Thinking about it more with hindsight, if you're going to consider Red a good protagonist, you pretty much have to consider the vague implications of the character after Gen 1. It's what gave him a presence that looms over the series in a much more pronounced way. The idea of him being a literal silent character and the sheer intensity that comes from that also perhaps recontextualize the vibe of playing the games that feature him a little bit, and kind of fits with the idea that he gets to the point where he trains on a mountain alone and doesn't call his mother after a while. Some fans, however, may claim that this doesn't make Red a particularly good protagonist. An interesting face for the series perhaps, but perhaps not an inherently interesting lead character. It's a similar dilemma with plenty of other silent protagonists, but definitely magnified with Red, who is quite stoic. Comparing him to a traditional protagonist of a story like Ash is a bit tricky because of this, as you can now see more clearly. But there's no denying that Ash is still clearly based on Red, despite being different in many ways. But before we start talking about Ash, the games aren't the only version of Red I want to talk about. While the Pokemon Adventures manga isn't nearly as popular as the games or anime, it's still respected as one of the most developed continuities created within the Pokemon franchise. I don't want to spend too much time on this, as the manga has been around for quite some time, and there's way too much to cover here, especially since I want this to be more about the game version of Red. Even though Red talks and has a more defined personality in the manga still feels more closely tied to the games than the anime. The way the characters and world building is handled is pretty different, which is actually pretty cool since they all feel familiar, yet a different flavor of Pokemon. Red himself is what you would expect for a main character like him. He's brave, selfless, and very open to conversation. So even though the manga feels like it wants to have more common with the games than the anime, this version of Red will still remind you of Ash somewhat. He's not the best trainer at the start, but he does start off more competently than Ash. And even though Pikachu is not his first Pokemon, his Pikachu is also a bit of a jerk to him at first, just like Ash's. Much of his journey in the Red and Blue chapter is how you may imagine, with its own unique twists and turns. And yes, like in the game, Red does become the champion by defeating Blue. As the series would go on, other characters would take the center stage depending on the game it represented, with an increasingly mature Red making appearances throughout several of those chapters. The manga isn't as well known as the games, and usually people would still think of the game version of Red when they think of the character, which makes sense. But the manga version of Red is definitely more of a proper protagonist. But it's still apples to oranges, as the manga is very focused on character development, world building, and story. Pokemon Red and Blue have a story, and has some pretty obvious themes throughout it, but isn't very focused on character arcs. Blue actually has more of an arc through his downfall and eventual maturity in Gen 2 than Red actually does. If Red does have a character arc, it's through the lens of the player. If you were bad at the game and struggled to win your Pokemon, but continued to get better and preserved, then in a way, Red has a character arc in a sort of meta way through the player. I think that's the best description of Red. Meta. He is a manifestation of the player in the Kanto games, but afterward, when he is no longer in the player's hands, he is portrayed as the most ideal form of a young and efficient Pokemon trainer, and it's up to the player to stand up against that unrealistic idealization that they helped create. There's also the Origins anime adaptation, but this version of Red isn't too different from what you would expect. The minor details of how the story plays out has quite a few differences, but overall, the impression of the character doesn't bear any surprises. I don't want to say too much else about Origins Red, because while I like Pokemon Origins, it's definitely more of a quick theme park or roller coaster version of a Pokemon adaptation. It's rich with content, but still pretty short at the end of the day, and I don't want to spend too much time repeating similar points that I've already made, especially when making a comparison to another anime adaptation that's so much longer, let alone the Pokemon Adventures manga, which I find more properly comparable. And like the Adventures manga, I may also want to speak about Origins in a more focused way another time to do it justice. And again, I want our interpretation of Red from the core games to be our primary version to compare Ash, since he is the most revered in the fandom, and the one that's historically been used the most for the comparison for over 2 decades. So Ash, let's talk about him. As you can probably tell by the way I introduced this video, I think Ash is very underestimated within the context of this comparison. I'll be blunt and say, as a trainer, Red is probably better than Ash, even at this point within the Pokemon anime. Post-Kanto Red seems to represent the peak of what an ordinary trainer can become while using their favorite Pokemon. A lot of Ash's story arcs are constantly about self-improvement, an age-old shonen theme, but it works very well with the character and the series. He starts about as ignorant of a Pokemon trainer as you can get. He can't catch a single Pokemon in the first episode, and early on, makes some of the most obvious mistakes. Mistakes that a lot of players back in 96 and 98 made back when they first played Pokemon when it was totally new. No one started as some sort of expert in this series, and even when you got good at it, there was no Bulbapedia or Smogon as a mega information hub to tell you about every little piece of information or nuance you wanted to know just yet. So there was always something new you were learning organically. It's still going to be like that for youngcomers, but Ash was introduced when the series was barely a year old. You don't need that context to understand why he starts off as such a rough around the edges trainer, but it was definitely a factor at the time. And quite frankly, I find watching him learn the ropes of the Pokemon world to be really entertaining. Watching his growing relationship with Pikachu feels earned, and he earns the reverence of not only Misty and Brock, but other gym leaders as well. And not just in the Kanto region, but eventually around the entire Pokemon world. It's the fact that he so obviously started as an iffy trainer that makes this satisfying, and that the series really takes its time with it. He eventually does become a genuinely incredible trainer before your eyes. Now, to address the elephant in the room. A lot of people think Ash sucks as a protagonist because he couldn't win the big one for the longest time. Personally, I just can't buy this reasoning. That's not to say the way every league in the anime was handled perfectly. There's actually some contention to be had with them. But Ash not winning until Alola was mostly appropriate. Him losing makes the most sense in the Indigo League, as he still felt like a somewhat incomplete trainer. But the way he loses still felt like a horrible cop-out. He does win the Orange League, but many fans don't see it as something that should count. But I thought it was a nice little arc and a feather in his cap. But let's fast forward a bit to Unova. It was around this time that I think the Ash sucks compared to Red discourse kind of hit its peak. And I can't entirely blame people for saying this at the time. The black and white anime is pretty frustrating to watch. It was intended to be a soft reboot, but much of the writing doesn't really handle this tastefully. Even when something does make sense in universe, it still ends up making Ash look like he regressed as a trainer far too much. It was also when the whole Ash is immortal meme started popping up more and more, as if the guy is sacrificing potential Pokemon League wins to the gods in exchange for eternal youth. It was kind of funny at first, but it's been old for a long time at this point. It is admittedly really strange that they didn't age him by at least 2 years at this point, since it would still keep the appeal of him being a very young trainer. And yes, he's still 10 years old. The Pokemon Journey's official site literally says this. This doesn't make him worse as a protagonist, but it quickly becomes frustrating if you pay attention to the continuity of the Pokemon anime. Not to mention, they let Red age. This guy is like 30 in Sun and Moon. Like, come on, man. So yes, even though there's a lot of things that make Ash a good protagonist, there are definitely little things that are pretty strange in the anime. And the writing in the anime definitely has its peaks and valleys. Unova, for example, has some nice smaller arcs here and there, but there's no denying, and there's so many little things that make it harder to watch as a whole. And one of those things is how characters like Ash are handled. But to focus on that would also be gross cherry picking. The anime adaptations of Sinnoh, Kalos, and Alola exist and are all great, and a large reason for them being great is because of Ash's character. There's nothing quite like Ash facing off against Paul in the Pokemon League and putting an end to that rivalry and proving his point with Infernape. There are very few things as cathartic as that in the entire franchise. It's a moment between two trainers that aren't prodigies. They're just people with conflicting ideals on a collision course. That's what's great about Ash. He's not a chosen one. He's just a person that's always growing, just like us. And his presence is never overly idealized. Another thing about Ash that has made him a good lead protagonist is how memorable and even touching his relationships with other characters can be. We all know about his relationships with Pokemon like Pikachu, Infernape, and Greninja. But his connection to the human characters like Brock, Misty, May, Dawn, and Serena are all very well developed. Overall, as you can tell, I actually think there's a lot about Ash that a lot of fans have grown to take for granted. I mean, the character and anime have been ongoing for so long. I can't blame them entirely. I think they have did a good job freshening things up in terms of direction with Kalos, Alola, and Journeys. But you're still bound to find some patterns and get a bit burnt out on ongoing weekly anime that has been going on for 25 years. Man, I really can't believe Ash has been going on this Pokemon journey with us for a quarter of a century. I wish we could all have that kind of energy. So, is Ash a better protagonist than Red? Well, it depends on what you value more from a protagonist more in the Pokemon series. Do you prefer the blank slate style of protagonist that Red is in the games? How much do you value the more meta-level themes Red represents as the franchise has grown? Personally, I think Ash fits the label of good protagonist in a more traditional sense. But there are things that they ended up doing with Red that represent something I don't see brought up often enough beyond just him being a strong, iconic trainer. But let me know what you guys think about this topic in the comment section below. Hey, it's the outro. Isn't that exciting? Thank you for enjoying another Mystic Umbreon video. We're getting ready to enter the fall, and the final stretch of hype for Scarlet and Violet is here. The excitement for Pokemon's 9th generation is at its peak, and I couldn't be more excited. We've still got plenty to cover before then though, so keep yourselves locked in. If you're interested in more Mystic content, check out my TikTok and Mystic Umbreon Shorts channel. If we get the 10K followers on TikTok, and we're super close, I'll be doing a viewer's choice video. Also, if you're into fanfictions and what ifs, check out Mystic Reads. I offer a ton of creative spoken word content on there, so come and join me. That's all for now. Make sure you subscribe for more fantastic content, and I'll see you next time.